A widow knelt beside the iron stove, feeding it the last pieces of split pine, while her teenage son scraped frost from the cabin window. Behind them, a little girl lay buried beneath blankets, and the fire was already dying. Outside, the blizzard had swallowed their entire woodpile. Wind hammered the log walls. Snow pressed against the door. The boy rubbed feeling back into his hands and stared at the empty wood box as the stove began to tick with cooling metal. His mother touched the wall beside it. Cold. Another gust shook the cabin hard enough to send frost drifting from the rafters. Somewhere beyond that door were months of carefully stacked fuel, buried beneath drifts they could no longer reach. The boy looked at his sleeping sister. Then at the wooden door, his mother saw the thought forming before he spoke. "We could burn it." For several seconds, she said nothing. Then the fire went out. 3 hours before dawn on the 12th of January, 1882, the fire inside Elsie Vanderberg's cabin surrendered to the cold. She had watched the glass coal collapse into gray powder the way a person watches. The final breath leaves someone they love, knowing there is nothing left to do but witness. Outside the cabin at Otter Ridge, a blizzard that had raged for 3 days without pause showed no sign of ending, and somewhere beneath 6 feet of wind-hardened snow lay a woodpile she could no longer reach. Before we go any further into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. If accounts of ordinary people surviving impossible odds move you the way they move us, tap the subscribe button now, because tomorrow's story is even more remarkable than the one you are about to hear. The cold moved through the cabin walls, the way water moves through cheesecloth, patient and total. Elsie pulled both quilts around her shoulders and watched her breath form small clouds in the darkness above her face. The iron stove in the corner held nothing but ash and 3 dim embers that would die within the hour. She had burned her last piece of proper firewood at midnight, back when she still believed the storm would break by morning. It was January of 1882. She was 34 years old, and she had been managing the homestead claim alone for 8 months, ever since Hendrik had died. The cabin sat on 160 acres of mixed forest and meadowland in Beltrami County, Minnesota, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor and 9 miles from the small town of Ashfield Crossing. Hendrik had built the cabin the year they arrived, using the same methods every other settler in the county used. Notched pine logs at the corners, mud chinked between the gaps, a single plank door, 2 small windows, a roof of split cedar shingles. It kept out rain and most of the wind, and that had seemed sufficient at the time. The woodpile stood 20 feet from the cabin door. Hendrik had always kept it well stocked, the split lengths arranged in neat rows under the shallow overhang of the roof's edge. After his death, Elsie had maintained the same system. She split wood every few days. She kept the pile organized. She made sure fuel was ready. The arrangement had carried her through autumn and early winter without incident. Then the blizzard arrived on the 9th of January. The first day brought heavy snow driven by rising wind. Elsie had made half a dozen trips to the woodpile, fighting through deepening drifts each time, carrying armloads back to the cabin, with her arms burning from the weight. By evening, the snow was waist-deep and still falling. She had brought in what she believed would last through the night, and perhaps through the following morning. The second day, she could barely force the door open against the snow piled against it. She squeezed through and fought her way to where the woodpile should have been, and she found nothing but a uniform slope of white. The wind had built a drift that swallowed the entire stack. She dug with her hands until her fingers went numb and would not answer her, finding only frozen chunks that might have been split wood underneath, or might have been anything else. After 20 minutes, she retreated to the cabin before frostbite could take her fingers. She had burned her indoor supply carefully, rationing each piece the way a mother rations bread when the flour runs low. But wood burns at the rate it burns, no matter how carefully you feed it to the flames. By the third day, she had turned to the furniture. A kitchen chair went into the stove piece by piece. Then part of a small shelf Hendrik had built to hold Lila's dolls. Then the second chair. The wood was dry and burned hot, but there was not much of it. And now at 3 hours before dawn, the last piece had gone in 90 minutes before, and she had nothing left to burn except the walls themselves. Wesley slept behind the curtain that separated the sleeping area from the main room. He was 13. He had been sleeping deeply because he had spent the previous afternoon helping her drag a broken washstand from the lean-to for fuel, and the labor had cost him. Lila lay curled against her brother, 11 years old, her small breath making its own faint cloud in the freezing air. Elsie had piled every blanket in the cabin on top of them. She would not wake them. She would not have them see what she was seeing. She sat fat by the dead stove in her chair with her hands wrapped around a mug of water that had begun to skin over with ice. And she thought, with the strange calm that comes to people, at the edge of things, about the words Silas Whitcomb had spoken to her the week before Christmas. He had cornered her outside the Ashfield Mercantile with the polite half-smile he wore in public, and he had lowered his voice, the way a man lowers his voice when he wants a woman to understand that what he is about to say is meant to help her. A woman should not try to hold land alone. The first winter would teach her what a widow needed to learn. He would be prepared when the lesson had been received to make her a reasonable offer for the parcel. She had thanked him for his concern and turned her back on him and walked into the store, and she had not thought of the exchange again until this moment, sitting in the black cold of her own cabin, watching her breath turn to snow inside her own kitchen. She thought about Hendrik then, because her mind had run out of practical things to think about. She thought about the day he had died, which had been the 23rd of May in the previous spring, and which was still, after all these months, the only day of her adult life she could not remember correctly. Fragments returned. The wet smell of the felled leaves, the angle of the sun through the canopy. The sound Peter Fitzgerald had made when he had come running down the wagon track shouting her name. The tree had caught in the crown of another tree on its way down, hung there for a moment in the sort of suspension that fools a man into believing he has time, and then had dropped without warning, while Hendrik stood beneath it, calculating which way to pull. He had died instantly. 3 neighbors had helped her bury him on the rise above the creek that ran along the north edge of their property, on a day so warm with new spring that the mourners had loosened their collars at the graveside. Pastor Halloran of the Swedish Lutheran Church at Ashfield Crossing had spoken words she had barely heard. Wesley had stood beside her, silent and pale, 13 years old and already understanding that the summer ahead would ask more of him than any summer of his life. Lila had wept into Elsie's skirt. 5 neighbor families had come. They had brought food. They had offered condolences. Several of the men had suggested gently that a widow with 2 small children ought to sell the claim and return to her sister's farm in Iowa. She had thanked them politely and declined. Hendrik had filed the claim in 1879. They had lived on the land for 2 full years by the time he died, and the Homestead Act required 5. If she left now, they would forfeit everything her husband had bled into that ground. She would stay. She would complete the claim herself. The neighbors had exchanged glances at that. They had said nothing more. A widow completing a homestead claim alone was unusual, but not impossible. She was strong. She knew how to work. But there had been doubts unspoken in their faces. Could she manage the heavy labor? Could she cut her own firewood? Could she survive a Minnesota winter without a man in the cabin? She had heard the doubts. She had chosen not to hear them. The summer of 1881 had passed in a kind of exhausted rhythm that left her no time to grieve properly. She had tended the garden Hendrik planted before he died. She had harvested vegetables and preserved what she could in the root cellar, and traded surplus in Ashfield Crossing for salt and flour and coffee. Wesley had helped with the heavier work, but he was still a boy, and he lacked his father's strength. Together, they had cut hay for the 2 cows and the mare. They had repaired fence rails that had rotted through in the wet spring. They had split firewood whenever the daylight lasted long enough. By autumn, she had established a working rhythm. She rose before dawn. She managed the livestock. She cooked. She kept the cabin. She fell asleep each night, too tired to think about anything beyond the next day's tasks. It was survival rather than prosperity, but it was enough. The first stretch of winter had passed manageably. The woodpile Hendrik had built up during his last summer had carried them into January. Snow had come and gone in ordinary patterns. Then the blizzard had arrived. Now she sat in the dark of the 3rd night of that storm, and she understood for the first time since Hendrik's death that the neighbors' doubts had contained a truth she had refused to see. The system she had inherited was flawed. Everyone used it. Everyone accepted its failures as the price of frontier life. And the price, at 3 hours before dawn on the 12th of January, was that a mother of 2 would sit alone in a freezing cabin, listening to her children breathe and calculate how many hours remained before the cold entered their small bodies past the point of return. She heard Wesley stir. She turned her head slowly, hoping he would settle back into sleep. He did not. He rose from behind the curtain in the shirt and trousers he had slept in for warmth, his breath visible in the dark, and he crossed the room to stand beside her chair. He did not speak for a long moment. He looked at the dead stove. He looked at the empty wood box. He looked at his mother's face and understood everything without her saying a word. When his voice came, it was low and steady in a way that broke her heart because it was the voice of a boy trying to be his father. Mama, the door. We could burn the door. The frame is thick. There is a lot of wood in the door. She looked at her son. She looked at the door. She understood what he was telling her, and she understood what it meant that a 13-year-old boy was the one who had said it aloud. If they burned the door, they would live through the night. If the storm continued another day, they would be a cabin without a door in a Minnesota January, and the wind would come through the opening and finish what the cold had begun. She placed her hand on his cold, thin wrist. She did not cry. She had used the day's allotment of weeping on the buried woodpile. Not yet, Wesley. Not until we have no other choice. Go back to your sister. Keep her warm. If I need you, I will call you. He looked at her a moment longer. He returned to the curtain. She heard him settle again beside Lila. She sat alone with the dying embers and the mug of ice water, and she prayed the way people pray when they no longer believe in being answered. She prayed for the wind to drop. She prayed for the temperature to lift a single degree. She prayed for the sky to remember that a woman and 2 children lived on this small clearing at Otter Ridge and had not yet been permitted their measure of dawn. The wind fell at some point after 4 in the morning. She did not notice at first. When she did, she rose from the chair and went to the window and scraped the frost from the glass with the edge of a spoon. The snow had stopped. The sky beyond the cleared oval was full of hard, cold stars. She stood at the window for a long time watching the stars, and she did not weep, because she was too tired to weep, but she made herself a promise standing there that she would keep for the rest of her life. She was never going to sit in a cold cabin waiting for dawn again. She was never going to look at her son and consider the door as fuel. She would find another way. She did not yet know what the other way was. But she promised the stars that she would find it, because a woman who has looked into the dark and been permitted to walk back out owes something to the dark for the passage. The neighbors came within 2 days of the storm's end. They came the way neighbors come in country places, with covered dishes and mumbled sympathies and the awkward practical kindness of people who understand that death has been in the house recently and does not want to be discussed. Carl Kohler and his oldest boy came with shovels and dug out the woodpile in an afternoon of hard labor. Marta Rasmussen brought a loaf of dark rye bread still warm from her oven, and she sat with Elsie at the kitchen table and did not speak, because Marta understood that some silences were themselves a form of company. The Toivola family sent their eldest son across the frozen creek with a full cord of split birch as a gift, delivered without ceremony and refused any payment. Fitzgerald and Braun rode over together and helped restack the excavated wood under the eaves. Elsie thanked them all. She thanked them properly. She meant every word. But she was not listening to their kindness. She was listening to the fragments of conversation she caught when they thought she was in another room. She heard Carl Kohler say to Lars Rasmussen, in the low voice men use when they are being honest with each other about difficult truths, that Elsie would not last another winter. She heard Astrid Fitzgerald tell Helga Kohler that the widow ought to sell now, while Whitcomb's offer still stood because a woman alone could not run a claim through 5 full years. She heard the phrase Whitcomb was right past at least 3 times between different mouths. She did not confront any of them. She said nothing. She poured coffee and cut bread and accepted their help, and she filed away every word she overheard the way a merchant files away receipts against an accounting he intends to make later. When they had all gone, she stood in the middle of the cleared woodpile, in the early dusk, with her hands raw and cracked from the cold, and she understood that the community around her had already written her ending. The only person in Beltrami County who had not written her ending was herself. She rode into Ashfield Crossing 3 weeks after the storm to buy salt. She met Silas Whitcomb outside the mercantile. He was waiting for her. He had known she would come. He was a tall man in his late 40s, gray at the temples, with the still watchful eyes of a hunter who has learned to wait as long as the quarry requires. He owned the timber company that milled most of the lumber sold in 3 counties. He owned a substantial interest in the Ashfield Bank. He held quiet notes on half the businesses along the main street. He had come to Beltrami County in 1868 with nothing but a strong back and a talent for reading other men's weaknesses. And he had built, in 15 years, an empire that reached into every kitchen within a day's ride. He touched the brim of his hat when he saw her. His smile was courteous. His voice, when it came, was low and pitched to carry only to her, Mrs. Vanderburg. I heard about the storm, a terrible business. I am glad to see you standing. I am obliged for the concern, Mr. Whitcomb. I would like to raise my previous offer. $350, cash for the claim as it stands. That would return you to your sister in Iowa with something in hand. The children could go to a proper school. You could rest. A woman ought to rest at your age after what you have been through. She kept her face still. She had learned the trick of stillness in the summer after Hendrik's death. When men had spoken to her with a certain tone, she had not been able to answer, because the grief had taken her voice. She had her voice now, she used it carefully. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Whitcomb. I decline. His smile did not change. His eyes changed. There was a small flicker in them, a movement no one who was not looking for it would have caught, and Elsie caught it because she had been looking for it. It was the flicker of a man being told no by a woman he had expected to say yes, and it contained, in its small brief passage, a promise she understood immediately. This is the last time I will be generous, Mrs. Vanderburg. By the winter after next, you will come to me. You will come and ask if the offer still stands. I will be sorry to tell you that by then it will be $100, because by then I will not need to be generous. I say this as a friend of the family. Your husband was a good man. He would want you cared for. Good day, Mr. Whitcomb. She walked past him into the mercantile. She bought her salt. She did not weep on the wagon ride home. She wept when she reached the cabin and had bolted the door behind her and had heard the children playing in the loft above her. And even then she wept for only 3 or 4 minutes before she stopped, wiped her face, and sat down at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of chicory coffee and a question she had not yet learned to ask. The question came to her that night in bed, after the children had fallen asleep, when she was staring at the black ceiling and listening to the small settling sounds of the cabin in the cold. The question was simple. Why did everyone use the same system for firewood? Why did every family in the county stack their wood outside where storms could bury it? Why did no one seem to find this strange? She had accepted it herself for years, because that was how Hendrik had done it. And that was how her father had done it in Iowa. And that was how every settler she had ever known had done it. But now, lying in the dark 2 weeks after nearly freezing to death, she found that she could not go back to accepting it. Something had cracked open in her during those hours by the dead stove, and through the crack a small persistent draft of a different sort was blowing, and the draft was called What If? She began the observations without deciding to. A trip to return a borrowed churn to Marta Rasmussen became a slow study of the Rasmussen woodpile, stacked hard against the north wall of their cabin, the drifts already climbing halfway up the split logs, Lars laboring with a shovel in a wind that had teeth. A Sunday visit to trade eggs at the Kohler place turned into 15 minutes of standing at the kitchen window while Helga poured coffee, Elsie's eyes fixed on the 30 yards of exposed ground between the cabin door and the woodpile, calculating the number of trips a family of 5 made across that stretch in a January week. She said nothing about what she was seeing. She simply took the information home, the way a woman takes home a length of cloth from the store, tucked away for a garment she has not yet cut. The Toivola place required a longer walk, north across the frozen creek where the Finnish family kept their claim among the tallest pines in the county. Elsie went under the pretext of asking about a saw blade, though the true purpose lay in her curiosity about how a family famed for its skill with timber managed the same problem everyone else faced. What she found unsettled her. The Toivolas stacked wood in cathedral-sized ricks, cord upon cord in the open air, uncovered because they believed exposure seasoned the pieces better. The outer layers glistened where snow had melted in a brief thaw 2 days before and refrozen into a shell of ice. She watched Otto Toivola break a piece free with a maul, the split face beneath the ice still dark with trapped moisture. And she understood that even competence had limits when the underlying method was flawed. She began asking her questions carefully, the way a person tests thin ice. How often did their fire struggle to catch on winter mornings? How much of each day disappeared into the labor of digging out fuel? Had anyone ever been caught outside in weather that turned dangerous while retrieving an armload of wood? The answers came back in the same tired shapes, spoken by tired people who accepted their circumstances as the weather itself was accepted. Yes to the failed fires. Yes to the buried piles. Yes to the near misses. But what else was there? Wood belonged outside. Storms were unpredictable. These were the facts. These had always been the facts. Elsie carried the answers home through drifts that reached her thighs, and somewhere between the Kohler gate and her own cabin door, a question rose in her that would not settle. Why did facts have to be facts? Why did generations of settlers accept a system that guaranteed suffering, when the suffering itself was the evidence of a design that had failed? She thought of Hendrik under the sudden fall of the oak, and she recognized the difference clearly for the first time. His death had been true accident, unrepeatable, unpreventable, a thing that happened once in a life. The buried woodpile was a different kind of thing entirely. It happened every winter. It happened to everyone. It was not accident. It was arrangement. The 1879 almanac came down from the shelf on the third evening of March. Wesley was reading aloud by the stove, some passage about crop rotation that Elsie barely heard, when her hand went to the top shelf, without any conscious decision, and returned with the little book bound in cracked green cloth. Hendrik's handwriting filled the interior margins of the planting pages. Brief notes about frost dates and the yield of the north field. The ink faded now to the color of weak tea. She turned past those pages until she reached the empty margins toward the back, the pages meant for reflection and record. She sharpened a pencil with her paring knife. She drew a rectangle. Around that rectangle she drew another, larger one. Lila looked up from her mending, and her voice carried the particular skepticism of an 11-year-old who had recently decided her mother was foolish about too many things. What is that supposed to be? Elsie did not lift her eyes from the page. A house inside a house. Leela made a small sound of dismissal and returned to her stocking. But Wesley had gone quiet, his fingers still marking the almanac passage he had been reading, watching his mother's pencil move across the paper. He did not ask what the drawing meant. He seemed to sense that his mother was somewhere she needed to be alone, and he returned to his page, after a long moment, his voice picking up the sentence where it had broken. She sketched for 2 hours that night. She sketched again the next evening, and the next, filling the almanac's margins with rectangles and cross-sections, with roof pitches and post spacings, with numbers scratched out and rewritten. She had no training for this work. She had learned to measure and cut from watching Hendrik build fences and repair the barn, and before him from watching her father in the small Iowa town where she had grown up, a wheelwright's daughter with rough hands from an early age. What she knew of engineering came down to observation and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. What she did not know, she would have to reason her way toward, alone, with nothing but a pencil, and the memory of a night when she had almost died. By the middle of March, 12 pages of the almanac bore her marks. The design had begun to hold together in her mind the way a face holds together after you have seen it enough times to recognize it in a crowd. The outer structure would extend 14 feet from her cabin walls on 3 sides, leaving the south face open for the door. 12 posts of white pine, each roughly 10 inches in diameter, would carry the frame. The roof would pitch to match her cabin's existing roof, allowing snow to shed cleanly, with sufficient clearance overhead so that snow accumulating on the inner roof would never touch the outer one. Firewood would live inside this shell. So would workspace. So would every task that a Minnesota winter had for the entire history of white settlement in Beltrami County, driven out into weather that killed. The materials list frightened her when she finally sat down to price it. She would need iron nails in quantities she had never before purchased. She would need hinges. She would need dimensional lumber for portions she could not mill from her own timber, since a widow with a 13-year-old son and a crosscut saw could produce only so much finished board in a season. She would need a new saw blade because the one Hendrik had left was worn past reliable service. When she added the columns of numbers by lamplight late one evening in the third week of March, the total came to $35, and she sat for a long time staring at the figure without moving. $35 was very nearly the entire cash reserve she had built over the previous year. From selling eggs, from trading preserved beans and pickled cabbage, from the small handful of coins that came to her when a neighbor needed her to sew a shirt or mend a harness. $35 was the margin between surviving a bad summer and losing the claim. She spent a full night deciding, staring at the low-banked coals in the stove, hearing the timbers of the cabin creak in the cold. What she came back to, each time her mind tried to retreat towards safer arithmetic, was the memory of Wesley's face by the light of the burning chair leg. That particular expression a boy wears when he suggests something desperate and understands what he is suggesting. She was not going to see that expression again. She would spend the $35. She would spend everything she had, if that was what it took. A woman who has looked at her son across a dying fire and read her own failure in his eyes does not later begrudge the price of what will keep such a night from returning. The trip to Ashfield Crossing came on the 28th of March, on a morning when the roads had thawed enough to permit the wagon and the sky had cleared enough to promise the journey would not become another storm. She took Lila with her for company. leaving Wesley in charge of the livestock and the cabin. The 9 miles unfolded slowly under the horses' steady pace, past claims where smoke rose thin from chimneys, past fields still under patched snow, past the small Lutheran church where Hendrik was buried on the rise above the creek. Lila spoke little during the drive. Something about the seriousness of her mother's face that morning had communicated the weight of the errand, and the girl seemed to understand, in the way children sometimes do, that this was not an ordinary trip for ordinary supplies. Ephraim Doyle's hardware store occupied the middle of Ashfield Crossing's single main street, a narrow building of weathered plank with a sign that had faded to the color of driftwood. Doyle himself was a wiry Englishman in his late 50s, sharp-eyed and precise, who had operated the store for 15 years and knew every settler within 20 miles by name and by the state of their credit. He greeted Elsie with the polite reserve he showed to widows, a manner intended as respect, but which contained at its edges the faint condescension of a man who assumed the woman before him would ultimately require rescue by someone else. She placed her list on the counter without preamble and waited while he read. The list was longer than any Elsie had ever brought him. Doyle read it once, then read it again, and, when he looked up, his expression had shifted from polite reserve to genuine confusion. "This is considerable hardware for spring work. Are you helping someone build a barn?" She met his eyes without flinching. "I am building a structure that will enclose my cabin. A shed, essentially, but larger, and configured to shelter firewood beneath the same roof that shelters the house." Doyle set the list down carefully, as if it might crumble under rough handling. "Around your cabin. Not adjacent to it. Around it." He was quiet a moment. Then his voice took on the tone men used when they wished to be helpful, without appearing to doubt. "Such a project would consume considerable material. The labor alone for a woman working essentially by herself would occupy the entire season. There are simpler solutions to the problem of firewood storage." She had prepared for this conversation on the ride into town. Her answer came without heat. "I have considered the simpler solutions. They are what nearly killed me in January. I will build what I have designed, or I will not survive another winter like the last one. There is no third option that interests me." Doyle held her gaze for a longer moment than she had expected, and something in his face changed, a small flicker of respect that surprised her. He picked up his pencil and began to write out the order. She left the store with the promise that her lumber would arrive by rail within 2 weeks, and that she could collect the smaller items immediately from Doyle's stockroom. Lila was waiting on the wagon seat with her hands buried in her mother's second-best shawl against the cold, and as Elsie climbed up beside her, she felt, for the first time since the January storm, a small, unfamiliar lightness. The decision had been made. The money had been spent. Whatever came next would come, but the direction was chosen. She had turned the wagon toward the road out of town when she saw them. 2 figures on the boardwalk in front of Doyle's store, one of them Doyle himself in his shirt sleeves, the other a taller man in a dark wool coat and a hat of expensive felt. Doyle was speaking rapidly, gesturing back toward the store, and the taller man was listening with the still attention of a hunter watching game. Elsie recognized him before she saw his face clearly. The set of the shoulders alone was enough. Silas Whitcomb stood on the boardwalk of Ashfield Crossing in a coat that would have paid for her lumber twice over, and Ephraim Doyle was telling him, in the animated pantomime of a subordinate reporting to a superior, what the widow Vanderburg had just purchased. She did not slow the wagon. She did not look again. But the picture entered her memory the way a hot coal enters cloth, and by the time the horse had carried them past the grain elevator and out onto the open road, Elsie understood something she had not understood before. Doyle did not own his store outright. Doyle owed money somewhere, and the somewhere was Silas Whitcomb. And whatever Elsie had believed private about her plans was already at this moment being carried to the ear of the one man in Beltrami County who most wanted to see her fail. She did not tell Lila what she had seen. There was no purpose in frightening the girl over something Elsie could not yet act upon. She drove home in silence, watching the road, thinking about how a widow with no legal power and no financial standing might defend a construction project against a man who could reach into every store, every bank, and every conversation within a day's ride of her cabin. She thought about it through supper. She thought about it while banking the fire for the night. She thought about it in bed, lying on her back in the dark, listening to Wesley's steady breathing on the other side of the curtain, and the answer she reached before sleep was cold and simple. She would build faster than he could interfere. She would work in the daylight and prepare in the evening, and if Whitcomb wanted to stop her, He would have to do it in the open where witnesses could see. The lumber did not arrive in 2 weeks. The lumber did not arrive in 3. Elsie made the trip back to Ashfield Crossing at the beginning of the 4th week and found Ephraim Doyle unable to meet her eyes. A sheaf of paperwork spread on his counter that he pretended to be organizing while he explained, in a voice pitched deliberately low, that there had been an unexpected delay at the railhead. Some confusion with the manifest. The order would be filled as soon as the next shipment arrived from Duluth. He could not say precisely when that would be. Elsie listened without interrupting. When Doyle finished, she asked one question gently, the way a woman asks after a sick child. "Ephraim, does Mr. Whitcomb hold a note on this store?" Doyle's silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds, and it was answer enough. He raised his eyes finally, and what she saw in them was not hostility but shame. "I am sorry. There is very little I can do. He owns pieces of nearly everything here." She nodded once slowly. "Then get me my lumber, Ephraim. Get me my lumber when you can, because whatever he pays you is not worth what will happen if I lose another child to that woodpile." Doyle's mouth worked for a moment. She did not wait to see what he might say. She turned and walked out of the store. The lumber arrived 9 days later without further comment, delivered to her homestead by a teamster who accepted his payment and departed without meeting her eyes. Elsie stacked the boards herself along the south wall of the cabin under a tarp weighted with stones, and she began that same afternoon to feel the presence of Silas Whitcomb pressing against her life like weather. It came in small forms at first. A note she had expected from Carl Kohler about borrowing his auger did not come. A promised delivery of split cedar shakes from an itinerant peddler who had done business with her the previous summer failed to materialize, the peddler apparently having taken his goods to another territory entirely. When she rode to church on the second Sunday of April, 3 families who had always exchanged nods with her in the churchyard turned their faces away, and one of the Braun daughters visibly stepped back when Elsie passed her in the aisle. She did not understand the mechanism of it until Marta Rasmussen came to the cabin on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the 2nd week of April, carrying a covered basket of bread and a face that would not settle. Marta was a small dark-haired woman with the fine bones of her Danish grandmothers, and eyes that had seen enough hardship to make her sparing with false comforts. She set the basket on the table and did not sit. She spoke as if the words had been prepared during the walk over and could not be softened. "Elsie, I have to tell you something that will make you angry, and I am telling you because Lars will not, because Lars is afraid, because we all are." Elsie poured coffee and set the cup in front of her. "Sit down, Marta. Tell me." Marta sat. Her hands did not release the shawl she had pulled tight around her shoulders. The story came out in pieces. Whitcomb had been to see nearly every family within 5 miles of Otter Ridge over the past 3 weeks, riding out personally in his good coat and his good boots, calling on each of them in turn, sitting in their kitchens and drinking their coffee, and delivering the same message dressed in a dozen different phrasings. The Vanderburg widow was overreaching. She would ruin herself with her project. The neighbors could of course do as they wished, but Whitcomb held notes on the Ashfield Bank, and he held the mortgage on the Kohler Smithy tools, and he had recently acquired a substantial interest in the mercantile that extended credit to the Fitzgeralds, and he would think it most unfortunate if any family assisting the widow's foolish construction should find their own affairs suddenly complicated. He had smiled while he said these things. He had touched no one's arm and raised no voice. He had simply left in each kitchen the clear understanding that helping Elsie Vanderburg would be expensive. Elsie sat for a long time after Marta finished. The rain moved across the roof in soft, uneven passes. She had known, since the morning she had watched Doyle report to Whitcomb on the boardwalk, that something like this was coming. She had not prepared herself for how thoroughly it had already been done. "Who has agreed to help me?" Marta's voice was very quiet. "No one, Elsie. No one has said so aloud, but no one will come. Not Lars, not Carl, not the Toivolas. The women wish they could. The men are frightened for their livelihoods. I am sorry. I am so sorry." Marta reached across the table and took Elsie's hand, and Elsie led her, but the gesture felt like something happening in another room, at a great distance from where her own thoughts had gone. She walked Marta to the door when the coffee was finished. She thanked her for the bread. She stood in the doorway, watching the smaller woman make her way down the muddy track toward the road, and when Marta had passed out of sight around the bend, Elsie closed the door and turned back into the cabin and stood very still in the center of the room. Wesley was at the table oiling a harness, his eyes on his work but his ears clearly on his mother. Lila was on the floor by the stove with the cat. Elsie looked at them both. at the small, worn shape of the life she had preserved through will alone. And she understood that Silas Whitcomb had just made her a promise. He had promised that she would build her structure alone or not at all. And he had made this promise not because he needed her land, though he wanted it, but because a widow who refused to be broken threatened something inside him that a purchased widow would not. She went outside into the rain. She walked past the tarped lumber, past the pile of posts Wesley had helped her strip of bark over the winter, out to the middle of the clearing where the cabin sat surrounded by the space her design would fill. She stood in the rain with her hair going wet against her skull, her hands loose at her sides, and she felt her knees go before she felt herself decide to kneel. The mud accepted her weight. She stayed there for what might have been a minute or 5, her breath uneven, tears mixing on her face with the rain, so that afterwards she could not have said whether she had wept. What she remembered later was not the kneeling. What she remembered was the moment she stood up. She rose out of the mud slowly, deliberately, and she walked back to the woodpile she still had from winter, and she selected the axe, and she carried it to the first stump she had marked for a post. Whitcomb wanted her alone. She would be alone. She would be alone with an axe and a boy, and a daughter who was learning to knead bread, and she would build what she had drawn. And Whitcomb would watch her build it, and by the time he understood what he was watching, she would already be finished. The digging began on the 22nd of April. The ground still held frost 18 inches down in the shaded places, and Elsie broke it with a long iron bar, borrowed years earlier from Hendrick's brother in Iowa, and never returned. She struck the bar into the earth and pried and struck again, working around the marked circle for each post hole, until the frozen ring gave way and she could reach the softer soil beneath. Each hole required nearly 2 hours. She measured the depth with a stick cut to 3 feet, checking and rechecking, because a post set above the frost line would heave and shift with the seasons and betray the structure years later when she had forgotten why she had cut a corner. She would not cut this corner. She would not cut any corner. If she was to be alone, then every joint would have to bear the load of her aloneness for the rest of her life. Wesley worked beside her when the farm chores allowed. At 13, he had begun the sudden growth that would carry him past his father's height within 4 years, though his body had not yet grown into itself, and he moved with the loose uncertainty of a colt. He handled the cross-cut saw on the felling of the pines, standing at one end while his mother stood at the other, and they worked out a rhythm that Hendrick had used in the same clearing 3 years before, a pull and a pull, breath in and breath out, the blade eating a bright wedge into the pale wood. Each pine took most of a day. When the tree came down, they limbed it together and cut it to 12-foot lengths, and Elsie sat in the evenings with the draw knife, stripping bark from the trunks by lamplight, the pale wood emerging beneath her hands as if she were undressing the trees for burial. Her palms opened in the second week. The blisters rose, broke, wept clear fluid onto the axe handle and the draw knife handle and the bar. She bound them with strips of muslin and continued. In the third week, the blisters healed into calluses that would not leave her hands for the rest of her life. Her back ached in a place she had not known could ache, a burning band across her lower spine that only lying flat on the pine floor of the cabin at the end of the day would ease. She lay on the floor while the children ate their supper, staring at the smoke-blackened rafters, listening to Wesley describe to Lila the exact angle at which the day's tree had fallen, and she felt her body remaking itself into the tool she needed it to be. The change in Lila came on a Wednesday in the middle of May. Elsie had come in at dusk, with her hands too stiff to lift a spoon, and Lila had watched her mother sit at the table in silence, unable to reach for the bowl of soup Wesley had ladled out. The girl rose from her stool without a word. She carried the bowl around the table and set it in front of her mother. She took up the spoon and dipped it and lifted it to her mother's mouth, and Elsie opened her mouth and swallowed because the alternative was to weep in front of her daughter, and she had already used the day's allotment of weeping on the 3rd post hole. Lila fed her 7 spoonfuls of soup. On the 8th spoonful, the girl's face broke, and she set the spoon carefully in the bowl and put her forehead against her mother's shoulder. "I am sorry I said it was foolish. I am sorry I said the drawing was a house inside. A house like it was a stupid thing. I want to help. I do not know how to help, but I want to." Elsie lifted her ruined hand and put it against the back of her daughter's head, and she found that her voice, which had been unavailable all day, came back to her softly. "You are helping me now, Lila. You have been helping me since March. I did not know how to tell you." The 12 posts stood by the end of May. Elsie walked the perimeter one evening with the sun setting behind the cabin, and she saw the skeleton of the things she had drawn in the almanac margins begin to take shape in the world. And the sight of it was so unlike the drawing, so much larger and rougher and more physically demanding of the space it occupied, that she nearly did not recognize it as her own design. The horizontal beams came next, notched over the tops of the posts, spiked with iron nails and pinned through with oak pegs. Wesley had shaped by the fire in the evenings. She and the boy raised each beam together, propping one end on a rest built of scrap, then lifting the other end into place while the muscles in her shoulders sang with a heat that she now understood as ordinary. By the middle of June, the frame stood complete, a strange gaunt cage of pine encircling three sides of her home, and neighbors passing on the road slowed their wagons to stare, and no one stopped to speak. The sound woke her on the night of the 17th. Not a loud sound. A brief scraping, then a pause, then another brief scraping, the sort of noise a raccoon might make on a loose board, except that this noise carried a rhythm that no animal produced. Elsie lay still for a full minute, listening past the small breathings of the children, and then she rose, took the shotgun from its pegs above the door, and stepped outside into the moonless dark with the barrel held low. The scraping had stopped by the time she reached the frame. She circled the structure with the caution of a woman who had lived long enough among wild country to know that human threats moved more quietly than the animal kind. She found nothing. No footprints she could read in the moonless dark. No lingering shape at the edge of the trees. She stood in the middle of her half-built shed for a long time before returning to the cabin, and she did not sleep again that night. The morning showed her what the darkness had hidden. 3 of the 12 posts had been cut nearly through at the base, deep angled saw cuts running from the outside face inward, halted just before completion so that the posts still stood but would fail catastrophically the moment weight came fully onto them. Whoever had done it had known exactly what they were doing. A partial cut at the base would not be visible from a distance. The frame would appear whole. When the roof went up and the snow came, the compromised posts would give way in the middle of a January night, and the entire structure would collapse onto the cabin beneath. And any death that resulted would be attributed to shoddy construction by a widow who had overreached. Elsie stood in front of the first damaged post with the morning sun on her face and felt something ancient wake in her chest. Not rage exactly. Something colder and more patient than rage. She called Wesley to her side. She showed him the cuts. She watched his young face work through fear, then anger, then the same cold understanding that had settled in her own chest. He did not need her to explain who had done it. What are we going to do? Her voice was quiet. We are going to find out who he sent. Then we are going to make certain the story of what he sent them to do reaches ears he cannot silence. Wesley found the boy that afternoon. He had gone out with a rifle to check the trap line, more as a pretext to walk the wood line and look for tracks than out of any real expectation of catching game. And near the north edge of the property, in a hollow where 2 fallen pines made a natural blind, he had come upon Silas Whitcomb's youngest son crouched over the ashes of a small fire that had not been out long. The boy was 17, tall and thin, like his father, but without his father's hardness, a soft-featured boy who had never done a full day's field labor in his life. He had 2 hired men with him, both of them the sort of drifter who took work no one else would touch, and both of them had made the mistake of leaving their rifles leaning against the fallen pine while they warmed their hands over the coals. Wesley did not shoot. He simply stepped out of the trees with his own rifle raised, and the 3 of them had frozen the way rabbits freeze when they know they have been seen. He had marched the Whitcomb boy home at gunpoint. The 2 drifters he had allowed to run. The boy sat in Elsie's kitchen with his hands on the table where she could see them. And after Wesley had gone outside to keep watch, the story came out of him without much prodding. His name was Alden. His father had told him nothing, but he had overheard the arrangement being made in the study of the Whitcomb house in Ashfield. His father counting out coins to the 2 drifters, the instructions delivered in a low voice about which posts to cut and how deeply and by what date. Alden had followed them tonight not to help but to see, because he had begun in recent months to suspect his father of things he did not want to believe, and he had needed to see it with his own eyes so that he would know. He was crying by the time he finished. He was not asking for mercy. He seemed to be asking, without knowing he was asking, for someone to tell him what a boy of 17 was supposed to do with a father who arranged the deaths of widows. Elsie made him tea. She let him drink it. When he had stedgied, she spoke to him with more gentleness than she had thought herself capable of that morning. Alden, I am not going to hold you accountable for what your father has done. I am going to send you home. What I ask is only that if you are ever asked, by anyone. Whether you saw what you saw tonight, you tell the truth. Can you do that? The boy nodded without speaking. She let him go. She watched him walk down the muddy track toward the road with the same weary posture she had seen on Marta Rasmussen a month before, and she understood that Whitcomb had done more damage inside his own house than he had yet done outside of it. She did not go to the sheriff in Ashfield. She had understood since the day of Doyle's report on the boardwalk that the sheriff's badge in Beltrami County was pinned to a coat that Silas Whitcomb had helped to purchase. What she did instead was compose, by lamplight over the course of 2 evenings, a letter to Pastor Halloran of the Swedish Lutheran Church, whom she had known since Hendrik's funeral and who possessed, she had reason to remember, an old seminary friendship with the editor of the St. Paul Pioneer Press. The letter set down the facts without ornament. It described the January storm and her plans for the structure. It described the interference with the lumber order. It described the campaign of pressure Whitcomb had waged against her neighbors. It described the signposts. It named the boy who had confessed, though it made clear she would not use the boy's testimony except in the last extremity, and would prefer the story reach the public through other means. She sealed the letter with wax and rode into Ashfield on a Friday morning to post it herself, and she watched the mail clerk stamp it and toss it into the sack for the eastbound coach, and she rode home feeling, for the first time in weeks, that she had struck a blow of her own. Pastor Halloran came to the cabin 11 days later. He came in the buggy he used for visitations, a black-coated, gray-bearded man in his early 60s with the patience of long practice in listening to grief, and the sharp eye of a man who had watched his congregation be preyed upon for 2 decades and had grown tired of watching it. He sat at Elsie's table and asked her questions for 3 hours. He walked the perimeter of the half-built structure with her and examined the sawn posts, which she had left uncut and reinforced with splints, for exactly this purpose, so that a witness of standing could see the evidence with his own eyes. He rode 2 miles south to speak with Lars Rasmussen. He rode 3 miles east to speak with Carl Kohler. He rode back to the cabin at sunset, and he sat in Elsie's kitchen with his hat in his hands. And he told her that his friend at the Pioneer Press would have a reporter on the northbound train within the week. The story ran on the front page of the Pioneer Press on the 7th of July, 1882, under a headline that Elsie would remember for the rest of her life. Timber Bebron wages quiet war on Minnesota widow. The reporter had done his work carefully. He had interviewed 6 neighbors, 4 of whom had spoken on condition of anonymity about the pressure Whitcomb had applied. He had obtained records from the Ashfield Bank showing Whitcomb's holdings. He had spoken with Alden Whitcomb, who had told the reporter, without prompting, exactly what he had told Elsie in her kitchen. The story was reprinted within a week in 3 other Minnesota papers, and by the middle of July, a Chicago paper had picked it up. Silas Whitcomb, for the first time in his adult life, found himself the subject of public conversation he did not control. The neighbors began arriving at the cabin on the 10th of July. Lars Rasmussen came first. He came alone, on foot, walking the 2 miles from his own claim with his hat in his hand. And he stood at the edge of Elsie's clearing until she came out to meet him, and he could not, at first, bring himself to speak. When his voice finally came, it was hoarse. "Elsie, I let him frighten me. I let him frighten me into leaving you to work alone. Marta has not spoken to me kindly in 6 weeks, and she has been right not to. I am here to work. If you will have me, I am here every day until this is finished, and I will bring my sons and I will bring my tools, and we will not stop until the roof is over your head." Elsie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about pride, and she thought about winter, and she thought about the fact that a woman who has fought alone does not have to keep fighting alone, once the terms of the fight have changed. "Come in the morning, Lars. Come at dawn. Bring your maul." Carl Kohler came the following day with a wagon load of iron nails he had drawn from his own smithy stock, hand-forged and finer than anything Doyle could have sold her. He brought 2 of his older boys, and a set of hinges he had made overnight for the door of the shed that Elsie had not yet even framed. He offered no long apology. He simply set his tools down inside the frame and asked where he should start. The Toivolas came on the 3rd day, all 4 of them, silent and competent, bringing with them a technique for laying birch bark shingles in overlapping 3-ply courses that would prove over the coming decades to be the reason Elsie's roof outlived every other roof of its generation in Beltrami County. By the end of the 2nd week of July, 12 adults and 7 older children were working on the structure at any given hour of daylight, and the sound of hammers and saws carried across Otter Ridge from dawn until dusk. Silas Whitcomb rode out to the property once on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. He did not dismount. He sat his horse at the edge of the clearing for perhaps 5 minutes, watching the crew work, watching the ridgepoles rise into their notches, watching Elsie herself, standing on the finished portion of the frame, directing the placement of a rafter. He was too far for his expression to be read clearly, but the men on the roof stopped their work to watch him, and Carl Kohler's oldest son came down the ladder and took up a position between the horse and the cabin with a hammer held loosely in his hand. Whitcomb turned his horse without speaking and rode back toward Ashfield. He did not return. The last shingle went on in the third week of September. The wood for the winter, 4.5 cords of split pine and oak, laid up on the raised platforms in the 3-row system Elsie had designed, was in place by the end of the first week of October. She walked through the interior alone on the evening. The last cord was stacked, running her hand along the rough pine of a rafter, feeling the way the space held its own quiet inside the noise of the wind that had begun to rise outside. Wesley found her there. He was 14 now, taller than she was, shoulders beginning to fill out the shirt he had grown into over the summer. He stood beside her without speaking for a while, looking up at the roof, and then he said the thing he had been carrying since the day the first post went into the ground. Pa would be proud of this. Pa would be proud of you. Her throat closed on the answer she wanted to give. She reached out and took his hand instead, the hand of the boy who had swung the other end of the crosscut. Saw through a summer that had asked more of a 13-year-old than any summer had a right to ask, and she held it for a long moment in the dim interior of the thing they had built together. The first frost came on the 29th of October. Elsie stood in the open south face of the shed at dawn with her breath making a small cloud in the air, looking out across a clearing rimmed silver, listening to the crackle of ice on the water trough. Somewhere to the east, the sun was beginning to push its light through the black spruce along the ridge. She thought about the January that had brought her here, about the almanac margins, about the $35, about the signposts and the letter and the men on the boardwalk and the boy at her kitchen table and every step of the long path that had ended in this particular sunrise. She thought about the winter that was coming. She did not know, standing there, what shape it would take. She did not know that Silas Whitcomb was at that very hour sitting alone in a study in Ashfield, with the lamp still burning from the night before, having done nothing for weeks but watch his empire begin to shift beneath him and try to understand how a widow with a pencil had unmade him. The first real snow of the season came down on Otter Ridge on the 7th of November, a steady fall of dry flakes that began at mid-morning and continued past dark, laying a soft even blanket across the clearing and the road and the black spines of the spruce along the ridge. Elsie stood at the open south face of the shed watching it come, a cup of coffee cooling in her hand, and she waited for the moment she had been waiting for since the day the last shingle went on. She set the cup on the workbench Carl Kohler had built along the east wall. She walked 12 feet to the nearest raised platform. She lifted an armload of split pine from the row nearest the cabin door, the pieces dry to the touch, the bark still bright where the draw knife had cut. She carried the wood inside, laid 3 pieces on the coals of the breakfast fire, and sat down on the stool by the stove to warm her hands. The entire errand had taken less than 3 minutes. Her shawl was dry, her boots were dry. The hem of her skirt had not touched a single flake of falling snow. Lila appeared in the cabin doorway with the particular slow gait of a child who has just understood something for the first time. She had walked out into the shed on her own in her house slippers to see what the snow looked like from the interior of the structure her mother had built. She stood now with her small face composed into a seriousness that made her look older than 11. Mama, it is snowing very hard out there. In the shed it is just cold. I can see the snow, but it does not touch me. Elsie set down the poker. She reached out and drew her daughter against her hip. That is what it is for, Lila. That is exactly what it is for. Lila leaned her weight into her mother without speaking for a while, and then she said, in a voice so quiet, Elsie almost did not catch it, I was wrong about you a lot of times this year. Elsie kissed the top of her daughter's head. She did not answer with words. Some acknowledgments belonged to silence, and this was one of them. Wesley discovered the second dimension of what they had built within the first week of active winter use. He came in from feeding the livestock at mid-morning on a bitter Tuesday, with an expression Elsie had not seen on his face in over a year, a compressed, excited look that reminded her sharply of Hendrik, on the day he had first plowed the north field. Mama, I was thinking, in the shed I can sharpen the axes, I can oil the harness, I can mend the trap chains, I can do every one of the things I have always had to do outside in the wind, standing there with my hands going numb, dropping tools into the snow. I can do all of it in the shed now. The only thing that still requires me to be out in weather is the animals themselves. Everything else has moved inside. She looked at him across the table where he had set the empty water bucket. The realization on his young face was the same realization she had reached herself 2 days before, but had not yet spoken aloud. And hearing it come out of him, unprompted, felt like watching a lamp lit from a lamp. Yes, that is the true gift of it. The firewood was only the beginning. The news of what Elsie had built began to travel through the community, the way small important news always travels in country places, along the invisible threads that connect kitchens and churchyards. Marta Rasmussen had returned home from her first visit in early November with a description of the interior of the shed so vivid that Lars had listened without speaking for the entire recitation, his coffee cooling in front of him, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. Marta had described the smell of dry pine. She described the way the air moved inside the space, cool but never damp, alive with the slow ventilation the design permitted. She had described the workbench, the raised platforms, the ordered rows of split wood, arranged by size for winter's different appetites. She had described walking through the interior in a light snowfall and remaining as dry as if she had been standing in her own kitchen. Lars had asked her one question when she finished. "Do you think it will hold under a full storm?" Marta had lifted her eyes to her husband's face and answered without hesitation. "I think it will hold under anything the sky can throw at it." Because she built it after the sky had already tried to kill her, and she built it to be the answer to that particular question. December arrived with a stretch of cold that closed the roads for 8 days running. The temperature at Otter Ridge fell to 18 below on the 11th and stayed within a few degrees of that reading for most of the following week. Water froze in the wash basin in the space between one washing and the next. The pump handle at the well would not move without hot water poured over it 3 times. In such weather, every family within the county reduced its outdoor activity to the minimum survival required. And every family paid the tax the winter demanded in cold hands and frostbitten cheeks and endless labor. Lars Rasmussen was up before dawn each morning to dig through the fresh drift that had piled overnight against the north wall of his cabin, working his shovel through snow that had frozen into a nearly solid mass, his shoulders burning by the time he had cleared enough surface area to pull free the day's fuel. Marta watched him from the kitchen window one particular morning as he took a break to press his gloved hands against his lower back, and she understood, in a way she had not fully understood before, that her husband was 53 years old, and that this labor was becoming dangerous. The Kohler place suffered a smaller crisis on the 15th. Carl's youngest son, a boy of 9 named Otto, had been sent to carry an armload of wood from the pile back to the cabin in a temperature that had fallen to 22 below. He had made the trip in mittens that were not quite thick enough for the day, and by the time he reached the door, his smallest fingers on the right hand had gone white and hard. Helga had known immediately what she was looking at. She had brought the boy inside, cut the mittens off him, placed the affected hand in a basin of water at the temperature of a warm bath, and sat with him for the better part of an hour while the fingers slowly returned to the color they belonged to. Otto had wept from the pain of the returning circulation. He had kept the fingers. But Helga had sat in the kitchen after the boy was asleep that night and had told Carl, in a voice that permitted no argument, that no child of theirs would carry another armload of wood across that open ground until a better system was in place. Carl had not argued. He had understood what she was telling him. He had understood, as Marta had understood watching Lars press his hands against his back, that a 9-year-old boy with white fingers was the same fact as a 53-year-old man with a burning spine, and that the fact was called a woodpile that lived outside. Carl arrived at Elsie's cabin on the 18th, on the pretext of returning a hammer he had borrowed during the July construction, though the hammer had never actually left her property. And Elsie recognized the excuse for what it was within 30 seconds. Of his stepping down from his wagon, she let him keep his cover. She invited him inside. She poured him coffee. She waited. Carl drank his coffee slowly, looking through the kitchen doorway at the interior of the shed visible beyond, and after a long time he set the cup down and spoke without meeting her eyes. "Elsie, I have to build one of these. Otto nearly lost his fingers last week. I cannot look at Helga across the table another winter, knowing I have not done what needs doing. I would like to ask you questions. I would like to write down the measurements. I would like to understand why you set the posts at 8 feet rather than 6, and why you left the upper band open under the eaves. and how you calculated the pitch of the roof to carry the snow load without collapsing under it. I am asking as a man who has watched his wife bury one child in her life and does not intend to bury another." Elsie did not answer at once. She reached across the table and took the coffee cup from him and refilled it. "Carl, bring paper next time. Bring a good pencil. I will show you everything I know. I will hold nothing back. If Otto keeps his fingers because of what I tell you, then every hour I spent digging post holes in April will have been worth it twice over." Ephraim Doyle came out to the property himself on the 21st, a thing Elsie had not expected and was not sure how to interpret at first. He arrived alone, driving his own buggy through snow that had drifted the road nearly impassable in 3 places, and he sat in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she had come to recognize on men who had spent recent weeks in the difficult act of reconsidering themselves. He told her the reason he had come. Silas Whitcomb had not entered the Ashfield Mercantile in 3 weeks. He had not been seen at church in 6. His clerk, a thin, nervous man named Peabody, who had worked for Whitcomb for 11 years, had told Doyle in confidence that Whitcomb had been sitting in the study of the Ashfield house from before dawn until after midnight for the entirety of the month, going through his ledger books with a look on his face that Peabody could not name. Doyle had come to tell Elsie this because he felt she was owed the information, and because he felt, though he did not use these words, that a debt existed between them that his silence would only deepen. He drank half a cup of coffee and rode home before dark. Elsie stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching his buggy disappear down the track, and she felt the first cold intimation of something she could not yet name, a sense that a storm was building that would not arrive from the west with the weather. The great blizzard began at dawn on the 14th of January, 1883. It began the way the storm a year before had begun, with a steady, moderate snow driven by a wind from the northwest, and Elsie recognized within the first hour that the resemblance was not accidental. The Dakota Plains produced storms in a certain seasonal rhythm, and the January storms tended to arrive on similar dates in similar shapes. Though the severity varied year to year according to conditions, Elsie did not entirely understand. She fed the animals early. She brought a full day's water inside the cabin from the pump before the pump handle froze. She built up the fire in the stove and banked it for slow burn, and she settled with her children to wait. By noon, the wind had risen to a howl that shook the outer boards of the shed and made the birch bark shingles chatter softly against their pegs. By late afternoon, the visibility outside had dropped to nothing at all, a solid moving wall of white so complete that the barn 30 yards to the east had become invisible from the shed's south opening. By nightfall, the temperature had fallen to 15 below, and the wind carried a sound that Elsie had never heard from a Minnesota storm before. A low, continuous moan that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the earth rather than from the sky, the voice of a system of weather that had decided to stay for a while. The storm did not weaken on the second day. It did not weaken on the third. Elsie moved through the routines of the interior of her home and shed the way a captain moves through the routines of a ship in heavy weather, with no wasted motion, no unnecessary exposure, no illusions about the intentions of the world outside. She fed the stove from the near platform every 4 hours. She made soup with the potatoes and salt pork she had laid in during the autumn. She read aloud to the children from the almanac in the evenings, choosing pages of astronomical tables and farmer's advice that Lila found soothing in the way some children find lists soothing, the small, orderly information a reassurance against the disorder of the sky. Wesley worked on carving a small figure out of a piece of scrap oak by the lamplight, a bird of some kind, the details emerging slowly under his knife. They played 3 games of dominoes on the second evening. They spoke quietly of nothing that mattered. The storm outside continued. On the third night, past 10 o'clock, when the children had already gone to bed behind the curtain, and Elsie was sitting alone at the table with a cup of chicory coffee and the almanac open in front of her, she heard the sound. It came from the south opening of the shed. A single dull thump, then silence, then a scraping that might have been a body dragging itself along the earthen floor. She rose from the table slowly. She took the lantern from its peg. She took the shotgun from above the door with her free hand. She walked to the cabin door and lifted the latch. The wind pushed the door hard when the latch released, and she leaned her shoulder against it to keep it from slamming. She stepped through into the interior of the shed with the lantern held high and the shotgun held low, and the light picked out, in the earthen aisle between the north row of platforms and the cabin's exterior wall, the shape of a man on his hands and knees. He was covered in snow that had begun to melt from the interior temperature and now ran in dark streaks down a coat that had once been fine wool but had frozen so thoroughly that its shape had gone rigid. His hat was gone. His hair was frozen against his scalp. As Elsie brought the lantern closer, she saw his face, and she saw who it was, and she stood for a full 10 seconds without moving, the lantern in her raised hand, her breath making small clouds in the cold air of the shed. Silas Whitcomb lifted his head. His eyes met hers. His lips were the color of old iron. When he tried to speak, no sound came out at first. He worked his mouth and tried again, and what emerged was hoarse and broken, a voice that had used its last strength to reach the light he had seen through the gaps in her outer wall from a distance of what turned out later to be nearly half a mile of storm. "Please, my horse." My horse went down. I could not tell where I was until I saw the fire glow. He tried to say something else and did not manage it. He lowered his head. He knelt in the aisle of Elsie Vanderburg's woodshed, with the snow melting off him, and made no further sound. She stood over him with the lantern for what felt like a very long moment, but was in reality perhaps 20 seconds. Her mind moved through possibilities the way a hand moves through the beads of a rosary, touching each one, considering it, moving on. She could leave him where he was. She could drag him to the south opening and put him back outside the way he had come in. She could shoot him and be done with the man who had tried to kill her son by proxy in June. The storm would explain any death. No court in Beltrami County would investigate. The choice she made in that moment would define her for the rest of her life. And she knew it. And she stood in the cold making the decision she had already, at a level below thought, made. She set the lantern on the workbench. She leaned the shotgun against the cabin wall. She bent and put her hands under Whitcomb's arms and hauled him upward with the strength she had earned that summer digging post holes. She got him standing. She half carried and half dragged him through the cabin door and lowered him onto the pine floor by the stove. She stripped the frozen gloves from his hands. She stripped the coat. She stripped the boots. She placed his hands and feet in basins of tepid water she drew from the reservoir on the stove, warming them by degrees the way Helga Kohler had warmed her son Otto's fingers a month before. She wrapped him in every blanket in the cabin. She ladled hot broth from the pot on the stove into a cup and held it to his lips and made him drink it in small swallows over the course of an hour. She worked in silence. She did not look at his face while she worked. She looked at the hands and the feet and the throat and the small motions of returning circulation. And she treated the body in front of her the way she would have treated the body of any half-dead stranger who had crawled to her door in a storm, and she did not permit herself to think, while her hands were doing this work, about who the body belonged to. Wesley came around the curtain at the sound of the door. He was fully awake within seconds of seeing what his mother was doing. He recognized Whitcomb faster than his mother had. He did not shout because Lila was still asleep behind the curtain, but his face contorted into an expression of such young, pure fury that Elsie had to speak sharply to keep him from making a sound she could not take back. "Wesley, come here. Sit down at the table. Not another word until I say." He obeyed her because she had never given him a command in that tone in his life. He sat at the table. He watched her work. When she finished the immediate care of Whitcomb's limbs and had covered him fully in blankets and had assured herself that he would not die in the next hour, she rose from the floor and crossed to the table and sat down opposite her son. Wesley's voice, when it came, was low and tight and shook with the effort of controlling it. "He tried to kill you. He tried to kill all of us. He sent men to cut the posts. He would have brought the whole roof down on this cabin in the middle of a winter night. And it would have been you and Lila under it, and I would have been outside feeding the horses, and I would have come back to find you dead. And you are giving him soup." Elsie looked at her son. She looked at the man on the floor by the stove. She looked back at her son, and she spoke to him with the particular care a mother uses when she is trying to hand a piece of the world across the table to a child who is old enough to receive it, but has not yet learned how heavy such pieces are. "Wesley, listen to me carefully. If we let him die tonight, we do not become the winners of anything. We become him. Your father did not raise a boy who would let a man freeze on the floor of his mother's kitchen because that man deserved to freeze. Your father raised a boy who would know the difference between what a man deserves and what a person does. I am not saving Silas Whitcomb because he is worth saving. I am saving him because we are worth more than that." Wesley did not answer at once. His young face worked through several things that Elsie could see clearly and did not comment on. He was 14. He was old enough to hold an opinion and young enough to have that opinion moved by the sight of his mother speaking to him as an equal. Finally, he lowered his eyes to the tabletop and nodded. Once a small, tight motion. He did not say she was right. He did not say she was wrong. He said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I hate that you are right." She reached across the table and took his hand and pressed it. "So do I sometimes. But I would rather hate that than hate what we would be if we did the other thing." Silas Whitcomb slept through the rest of the night and most of the following day. Elsie tended him at intervals, checking the temperature of his hands and feet, changing the blankets when they became damp from the sweat of his returning body heat, keeping the stove fed with wood from the near platform. The storm outside continued into its fourth day, and finally in the late afternoon began to weaken. By evening, the wind had dropped to a moderate breeze. By nightfall, the snow had stopped altogether, and a hard, clear cold settled over Otter Ridge under a sky of black glass and brilliant stars. Whitcomb woke on the fifth morning. He woke slowly into a body that ached in every joint and a mind that took several minutes to organize itself around the question of where he was. Elsie was at the stove making oatmeal when she heard him stir. She did not turn immediately. She finished stirring the pot. She poured a bowl. She carried it to the pallet she had made him on the floor and set it beside him and sat down on the stool 3 feet from his head. Whitcomb looked at her. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the interior of the cabin, at the shed visible through the open door, at the ordered stacks of firewood at the workbench, at the whole functioning organism of the structure his sabotage had failed to prevent. His eyes returned to Elsie's face. He tried to speak and had to try twice before his voice came. "How long have I been here?" "2 nights. The storm ended yesterday evening." He closed his eyes for a long time. They did not speak for the rest of the morning. He ate the oatmeal in slow spoonfuls. She brought him water. She let him sleep again in the afternoon. When he woke a second time, near dusk, she was sitting at the table, repairing a torn place in Wesley's coat by lamplight, and Whitcomb watched her work for a long time before he spoke. What came out of him then was not a speech. It was the fragmented voice of a man who had been alone in a room with his ledger books for 6 weeks and had said the things he had to say to himself already, and now had to say them one more time to another person. "I have been a certain kind of man for 49 years. I have understood women as obstacles to be moved and men as pieces to be arranged. I looked at you last spring and I saw a widow who would be more profitable to me broken than upright. I sent men to your property in June to cut the posts of your structure so that it would fall on you in the winter and I could buy the land at auction from your children's guardian for pennies. I did that. I want you to hear me say it so that you know I am not pretending I did not do it." Elsie set down the coat. She did not look at him. "I know what you did, Silas. Alden told me the day Wesley brought him home. Alden told me too a month ago. He walked into my study one night and told me he had been to your kitchen and that you had given him tea and that you had let him go without threatening him and that he could no longer live in my house pretending he did not know what I was." Whitcomb was quiet for a moment. He left the next morning. He is in Duluth now working for a shipping firm. He has not written. Elsie picked up the coat again. "I am sorry, Silas." He turned his head on the pillow so that he could see her more directly, and what she saw in his face when she finally met his eyes was an exhaustion so complete that it had passed beyond expression into a kind of transparency, as if she could see through him to the young man he had been before he had chosen the particular life that had brought him to her floor. "You have no reason to be sorry for anything you have done. I have been on the floor of your kitchen for 2 days eating food you cooked, wrapped in blankets you weave. You saved my life. You saved it by means of the very thing I tried to prevent you from building. Do you understand what I am saying to you?" She understood. She kept her hands on the coat. She did not answer. She had learned during the summer of the signposts and the letter to Halloran that some men needed to hear their own words come back to them undecorated, and Whitcomb was such a man, and she let him keep speaking. "I have thought about very little for the past month, besides the fact that I do not know how to stop being what I have been. A man can decide to change and still not know the shape of what he is changing into. I do not know the shape. I know only that when I looked up in the storm and saw the light of your fire through the gaps in your outer wall, I understood that I had spent 49 years trying to darken every window I could reach, and the last light left burning in the county was the one I had worked hardest to put out. I do not have language for what that felt like. I do not know that I have earned language for it." Elsie set down the coat a final time. She rose and crossed to the stove and refilled his water cup. She brought it to him and knelt beside the pallet to help him drink. "Silas, language will come. It is not what matters. What matters is what you do with the next 20 years. That is the only apology that will ever mean anything. Do the work. Do not tell me what you are going to do. Do it. He left on the 7th morning after the storm. Wesley brought around the mare, saddled her, adjusted the stirrups. Whitcomb walked stiffly out to the mounting block Carl Kohler had built beside the cabin door during construction. And he stood there for a moment holding the reins, looking at the shed and the cabin and the whole strange arrangement of the widow Vanderburg's homestead. Before he mounted, he reached into the inside pocket of the coat Elsie had dried for him by the stove and withdrew a gold pocket watch. He walked back to the workbench in the shed and set the watch carefully on the pine planks. This was my father's. He gave it to me when I turned 21. I want you to keep it. It is not payment. Nothing is payment. It is only that I need to leave something of value in a place where I know it will be seen every day, so that on the days when I am tempted to become again the man I was, I will remember that I do not own it anymore. He mounted the mare without waiting for her to answer. He rode out of the clearing and turned south on the road toward Ashfield Crossing, and Elsie stood in the door of the shed watching him go until his figure had passed out of sight around the bend. Marta Rasmussen arrived on snowshoes 11 days after Whitcomb's departure. She had walked the 2 miles alone because Lars was still splitting his way through a woodpile that had been buried by the storm to a depth that had required 3 days simply to reach. And she had come because she could not wait any longer to see with her own eyes how the Vanderburg shed had performed in the worst storm the county had recorded in 20 years. She stopped inside the south opening of the shed and stood without speaking for a full minute, taking in the dry earthen floor, the untouched stacks of firewood, the workbench with the gold watch, still lying on it where Whitcomb had placed it. Elsie had not moved the watch. She had not decided yet what to do with it. Marta looked at the watch and did not ask about it. She looked at Elsie's face and said, without preamble, teach me. Draw it for me. Draw it so that I can carry the drawing home to Lars and he can build one for us this spring. I do not want another winter like this one. I do not want to watch him age 5 years in one January again. Elsie spent the rest of that afternoon at the kitchen table with Marta, sketching the design on brown butcher paper. Marta had brought for the purpose, explaining post spacing and roof pitch, and the reasoning behind the partial walls and the elevated platforms. She held nothing back. She gave the drawings to Marta with the pencil marks, still smudging from the pressure of the strokes. And Marta rolled the paper carefully and slid it into the leather tube she had brought for the carrying. And she walked back to her own claim through the drifted snow with the design of the shed in her hand, as if she were carrying something more precious than any object she had ever transported. Lars Rasmussen broke ground on the 22nd of April, 1883. His version differed in details. He built a full 4-sided enclosure rather than Elsie's 3-sided design, using heavier timbers because he had access to a stand of larger pines on the eastern edge of his claim. He completed the structure by the middle of August, and Marta wept when she saw the finished interior, and neither of them ever again lost a night's sleep to the fear of winter fuel access. Carl Kohler began his own construction in early June, incorporating hand-forged iron brackets and hinges that gave his shed a refinement Elsie's lacked. Though the fundamental principle was identical, he hung a proper door on the south face and built more elaborate interior storage than she had bothered with. Helga said, in Elsie's hearing at the harvest picnic the following autumn, that she had not been so light in her spirit during a Minnesota winter since the year she had come to America as a bride. The Toivola family broke ground in July on the largest of the imitations, a version that incorporated a full lumber milling workspace within the shed structure, and by the end of the summer of 1883, the 3 shed cabins visible from the road between Ashfield Crossing and Otter Ridge had become a minor curiosity to travelers passing through the county. The idea spread outward through the informal networks that connected frontier communities to one another. A trapper who spent a night at the Rasmussen place in the winter of 1884 carried the concept 20 miles north to a family he traded with, and they built their own version the following summer. A family moving westward from Michigan through Beltrami County in the spring of 1884 stopped for water at the Kohler smithy and asked so many questions about the strange building arrangement that Carl finally sat down with them at his kitchen table and drew the design on the back of a feed sack, which they carried onward with them and eventually built from in the Dakota Territory. By the summer of 1885, variations of the shed cabin design existed on at least 30 homesteads within a 30-mile radius of Otter Ridge, And though no two were precisely identical, they all traced their lineage back to the 12 pages of margin sketches Elsie Vanderburg had made in a 9-year-old almanac. During the exhausted evenings of a February, she had barely survived. Silas Whitcomb sold 60% of the Ashfield Timber Company in the spring of 1884. He did not announce the sale publicly. It was recorded in the county land office as a transfer of shares and did not become widely known until months later, when it emerged that Whitcomb had used a substantial portion of the proceeds to establish a fund at the Ashfield Lutheran Church, administered by Pastor Halloran, for the specific purpose of assisting widowed homesteaders in Beltrami County during their claim completion periods. Whitcomb attached no conditions to the fund. He requested no acknowledgement. Halloran, who had insisted on transparency about the fund's origin over Whitcomb's objection, mentioned in a Sunday sermon in the autumn of 1884 that a certain benefactor in the community had endowed a resource that any qualifying widow could apply to without stigma, and that the community owed the benefactor no gratitude, because the benefactor had made clear that the fund was not a gift, but a partial repayment of a debt long overdue. He did not name Whitcomb. Everyone knew. Elsie completed her homestead claim on the 23rd of May, 1884, 5 years to the day after Hendrick had filed it in the land office at Duluth. She received the patent in the mail 2 weeks later, a document of heavy paper bearing the seal of the United States and the signature, in a fine copperplate hand of a clerk in the General Land Office in Washington she would never meet. She read the document twice at the kitchen table. She placed it in the wooden box where she kept the deed to the horse in the family Bible and the small daguerreotype of Hendrick that had been made in Iowa the year before their marriage. She sat for a long time with her hand on the closed lid of the box. Then she rose and went outside, and she walked to the rise above the creek where Hendrick was buried, and she stood at the head of his grave and told him, in a voice pitched only for him and for the wind, that the land was hers now, that it would pass to Wesley and Lila when she was gone, that he had not died for nothing. She did not stay long. The wind was cold. But when she walked back to the cabin, she felt the last small weight of the promise she had made to him on the day of his burial lift from her shoulders and blow away over the ridge, and she understood that she had kept faith with the dead in the only way the dead can be kept faith with, which is by refusing to let the living become smaller than the dead had believed them to be. Wesley grew into his height and into himself over the years that followed. He filed a claim of his own 8 miles west of Otter Ridge in the spring of 1889 on a piece of land Elsie had helped him identify during a long horseback ride the previous autumn. He built a shed cabin on it during his first summer of possession, working with a competence that had come to him through the summer of 1882 and had never left him. He married a young woman from Ashfield Crossing, named Ingrid Peterson, in the autumn of 1891, and their first child, a girl, was born in the shed cabin in the winter of 1893, warm and safe against a storm that had killed livestock across 3 counties. He named the girl for his mother. Elsie visited the child in the second week of her life and held the small, warm shape of her granddaughter for an hour in the light of the same kind of lamp she had drawn her margin sketches by. And she wept without shame, and Ingrid wept with her, and Wesley stood in the doorway of the shed watching the 2 women weep over his daughter, and did not entirely understand what he was seeing, but understood that he was not meant to interrupt it. Lila married a carpenter named Josiah Renwick in Ashfield Crossing in 1895. He was a quiet, steady man, 10 years older than she was, who had come to the county from Vermont in the late 1880s and had built a reputation for fine finish work on the houses of the merchants along the main street. He and Lila made their home above his shop in town, and Lila brought their children out to Otter Ridge every second Sunday through the summers and every third Sunday through the winters, and the grandchildren grew up knowing the interior of their grandmother's shed as intimately as they knew their own bedrooms, playing among the woodpiles in the summer afternoons, sitting on the workbench in the winter mornings, while Elsie showed them how to whittle small figures from oak scraps, the way Wesley had once whittled his bird. Silas Whitcomb died in the winter of 1897 of a heart failure that took him quickly in his sleep. He was 63. Pastor Halloran conducted the service, which was better attended than anyone had expected, and read a passage from the letter Whitcomb had left in his desk for the occasion, addressed to the congregation of Ashfield Lutheran in which he asked that no eulogy be given for him beyond the plain acknowledgement that he had done harm in life, and had spent his last years attempting without success to weigh the harm against the good and find them balanced. He asked that any who felt disposed to remember him do so by considering, when they encountered a widow in difficult circumstances, whether they were prepared to be the sort of person who helped or the sort of person who did not. Elsie sat in the second pew during the reading of the letter. She did not weep. She had done her weeping for Silas Whitcomb slowly over the 15 years since the storm, in the small increments that difficult reconciliations demand. She placed a hand on the shoulder of Alden Whitcomb after the service. Alden had come down from Duluth for the funeral. He was 32 years old now, a shipping clerk with a wife and 2 young sons of his own, and he was weeping openly for the father he had loved and been unable to live with. Elsie stood with him in the church aisle for a long moment, and she said what she had come to say to him. Alden, he wrote to me twice a year for the last 12 years of his life. He wrote about you every time. I've stopped hoping you would forgive him. I do not know if you can. I only know that he became a better man because of you leaving, and he understood that, and he was grateful for it even when it hurt. Elsie herself lived until the spring of 1904. She was 56 years old when the pneumonia that had taken so many of her generation across the Minnesota winters finally took her as well. In the cabin she had defended, surrounded by her children and 3 of her grandchildren, in the bed she had shared with Hendrik for 11 years and slept alone in for 23. Wesley closed her eyes. Lila held her hand until it went cold. The funeral, held on a raw April morning, drew nearly 200 people from the county, including the descendants of every family who had built a shed cabin in the decade after 1882. She was buried beside Hendrik on the rise above the creek. The stone Wesley set for her was cut from local granite and bore only her name, her dates, and a single line beneath, taken from a phrase Marta Rasmussen had once used in describing her. She refused the terms she was offered. The homestead passed to Wesley, who leased the fields to a young couple from Iowa in 1905 and preserved the cabin and the shed as they had been in his mother's time. He visited the property every month for the rest of his own life, keeping the roof patched, replacing shingles when the birch bark curled, tightening the joinery on the workbench when it loosened. He died in 1938. His daughter kept the property in the family until 1953, when the structure was finally taken down to make room for a modern house built by a nephew who intended to farm the land seriously. By then the shed had stood for 71 years, and the birch bark on its roof had been replaced only twice. Historians of the frontier occasionally encountered references to what settlers in northern Minnesota called covered cabin construction. In journals and letters written in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, the references were brief. The design was treated as an unremarkable local practice, a folk architecture of a particular region. Its origins vague. Few of the researchers who came upon the references realized that the practice had begun on a single homestead in Beltrami County, in the mind of a single widow, in the aftermath of a single storm. The story of how Elsie Vanderburg had built a shed around her cabin was never preserved in any formal record. Her name appeared in the homestead documents, in the census returns, in the church registers of Ashfield Lutheran, in Silas Whitcomb's letters when those letters were eventually deposited in the Minnesota Historical Society by Alden Whitcomb's grandson in 1961. Nothing in any of those documents identified her as an innovator. Nothing noted her contribution. The buildings themselves stood, for a time, as the only physical evidence of an idea born from necessity and proven through experience so bitter it had reshaped a life. They stood as silent witnesses to the truth that survival on the American frontier depended less often on strength than on the willingness of one person, in the dark hours after a near death, to sit down with a pencil and ask why the arrangements everyone had accepted had been arranged that way, and whether they might be arranged otherwise. Elsie Vanderburg had done exactly that. Dozens of families had lived safer and warmer lives because a widow at Otter Ridge had refused to accept that suffering through winter fuel access was an inevitable feature of the world. One man in Ashfield Crossing, who had spent the first half of his life becoming the sort of person who arranged the destruction of women like her, had spent the second half becoming the sort of person who could look at what she had built and understand what he was looking at and be changed by it. If this story has moved you tonight, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and consider subscribing before you go. because tomorrow we will bring you another true account from the American frontier, the story of a blacksmith in Kansas in 1889 who was told by every man in his town that what he intended could not be done, and who did it anyway, and changed a small piece of the country in the doing. Until then, remember Elsie Vanderburg. Remember that the world is not always arranged the way the world says it must be. Remember that a pencil in the margins of an old almanac can outlast the fortunes of the men who try to break the hand that holds it.